guys, welcome to today's video. In this video, we are going to be focusing specifically on providers, what it means from a context of Terraform, why is it important, and what are the key things that we need to know before we can get started working with providers. So first thing first, the first thing when that comes to mind when working with a provider or understanding a provider is this required providers block, right? And actually before that, so what is a provider? A provider is basically an entity that encapsulates a whole lot of APIs that Terraform can call under the hood to actually manage infrastructure. So for example, in AWS, you've got a lot of services, right? One service being S3 buckets. Now, S3 bucket has got an API that Terraform can use to actually initiate the creation of the bucket or deletion of the bucket, or even upload or create folders or hierarchies within that object storage, S3 object storage. And all of that is being done through API. And providers are basically a term that encapsulates a set of related APIs for a particular entity, which in most examples for Terraform that you see are going to be cloud providers, right? AWS, GCP, Azure. You're also going to see providers for Helm, for Kubernetes, and even there are partner providers like working with Alibaba Cloud, for example, right? And all of that just means that a provider is a segregated entity that manages a related set of APIs to actually interact with the underlying infrastructure in that particular entity, right? An entity, again, just to reiterate, is individual cloud providers like the public cloud providers, or can also be an actual system like Kubernetes, for example, or a tool like Helm, right? And to see a list of these providers, you can just go to the Terraform registry, or basically Google for Terraform providers, and then you can go to the registry, and it just gives you a list of all the providers that are currently available for Terraform. All of them are publicly available, right, in the Terraform registry. And actually, while we're at it, what is the Terraform registry? So if you're from a coding background or you're familiar with Python, which I'm sure if you're watching this video, you probably are already familiar with Python. So in Python, in order to start working with a library, you need to do pip install, then that library's name. Now, where is that library coming from? That's coming from a place called PyP, right? So PyP is the Python package index repository where all these open source Python packages or libraries are stored, really, for consumption for the rest of the dev community. And when you run pip install, it's actually pulling it out from PyP repository for a particular package or library. And Terraform registry is pretty much the same, but just for Terraform, right? Exclusively for Terraform. So in Terraform, there is a block called required providers, and this is where you go and specify all the providers that you want to be able to use, right? And the providers, again, being entities. So for example, in this case, I've got the structure of this is that you've got a key, which usually represents the local name of the provider that Terraform is going to be using in the within the code base. We'll come to that in a bit. And for every sort of key, you need to provide a mandatory argument for source. So source basically represents the fully qualified, well, in this case, the namespace / path, right? So this is basically telling Terraform that go into the Terraform registry and look into the namespace for HashiCorp. And in HashiCorp, you're going to find an AWS provider, basically. Now, since we haven't specified, so actually this is supposed to look something like this, right? Hostname. So if I put, this is actually supposed to, the fully qualified name looks like this. Path. Now, we are not providing the hostname bit of the convention in here, because if you don't provide any hostname, by default Terraform is always looking at registry.terraform.io, right? So when Terraform actually resolves it, it actually resolves it like this, without us actually exclusively having to specify it. That's just something we're getting because we're using the public providers or the open source providers from the Terraform registry, right? Now, if you've got a private registry, that's a different story. You actually have to specifically specify the host name, but I'm not going to get into that detail in this video. But if you do want me to cover a video on the private Terraform registry, then leave a comment and I'll create a video on that. So at a basic mandatory level, you need to provide the source argument for every sort of provider. So for example, if I was to create GCP, right, it would be something like Google, right? And then it would be HashiCorp Google. Now, why is this important, right? So this is important because this tells Terraform where to go. So when we run Terraform init, so init basically is the command in Terraform that does a lot of the initializing work, and a part of the initializing work is going out to the Terraform registry based on the required provider specified in here, and actually downloading and then basically downloading and installing all the underlying APIs for AWS and Google as per this example. Now, it's always not going to go and actually fetch it from Terraform registry, because in my case I ran it before, so I've got a Terraform directory in here, which is basically the cache. So that's where Terraform has already in a previous run, Terraform already went out to the Terraform registry and got all the APIs that it needs for AWS and stores it into the cache in here. But it doesn't for Google because I just added it in. So if I actually go in and run Terraform init, you'll see that actually I need to go to Terraform basics. So clear it, go run Terraform init here. So you can see that it goes and actually finds the latest version of HashiCorp Google, and it's just reusing the previous version of HashiCorp AWS. For AWS, it already had it, so that's why it didn't actually go and find it. But for Google, it had to. Now, there is another important argument in here that you should really use when working with production. If you don't use it, by default, it's going to be getting the most latest version for each of these providers, right? And that may be something that in a production environment you do not want, because any new version by default potentially could have right breaking changes to the APIs, and that could break your existing workflow with Terraform. That's why it's a good practice to sort of specify at least a minimum version, which basically just goes like something like this, right? So, and to know this version, you can just go, for example, to the AWS provider. And actually, this is quite handy in here. So for every provider, you can click on them, and there is a use provider button in here. So if you click that, it will show you how to set up the required provider for it, and it will show you right just the basic local block setup. So this provider block in here is literally just a block that sets up. I've got it in my code as well. It just sets up with some mandatory key parameter. For AWS, you need to specify region for every local provider block that you set up. If you don't specify region, then it errors out, because everything in AWS is very much region specific. Whereas for Google, you don't really need to do that. For Google, you could just do provider and call it Google and be done with it, right? For AWS, however, for AWS, it's quite important to give region, and there is a block for alias. Alias, we'll come to that in a bit again, but that just basically, it's just a way to distinguish between these two providers. Now, going back to the version, so as it shows in here, you can either explicitly specify the version you're using, or you can just specify a minimum version. So for example, 1.0.0, right? And these versions, so if you actually go into the documentation, if you click on this documentation link, it will take you to all the resources that you can manage through the AWS Terraform provider. And then you've got the version in here, and you can go and check all the versions if you want to, but this basically gives you a whole track record or the audit history for what has changed in the previous versions for Terraform and the relevant docs for it. And you usually want to set at least a minimum version so that you're making sure that every time Terraform is running the configuration as code, it's always using a particular version that matches this version constraint you're setting up in here. And if you omit it, it's just going to use latest by default. There is also a thing called dependency log file, which I have got in here. Now, a good practice is to actually have this in your version control, because then Terraform. So if you don't have a version set up in here, for example, then Terraform by default goes and gets the latest one. However, if you've got a dependency log file, Terraform is going to come and look here as well, and it's going to then use the version that was previously used, right, based on this dependency log file. So this file is has got a specific name, and it's known as the dependency log file in Terraform, and it just stores information about what version was used for a specific provider and few checks and related stuff that I'm not going to go into the detail in here, but there are more information about this if you want to read through the Terraform provider documentation. But yeah, so that's what sets up the that's what tells Terraform to use or reuse the previous version, basically. So you don't even actually have to specify a version here, but Terraform can still, based on this dependency log file, figure out which one to use. And yeah, so quickly going back to this alias in here now and the local name. So the local name, actually you could call it, for example, my cloud, right? But now that then means that you actually have to explicitly, for example, for this particular resource for AWS IAM role, you have to pass in this provider argument, and in here you actually have to say you actually need to create a provider block and call it my cloud as well, because the local name defined in here must match a local name, a provider declared with the local name. And you could just do something like my cloud in here. Now, this is only required if you actually go in and give it a name which is not the preferred name for that provider. So AWS's preferred name is AWS, basically. And why is it a preferred name? Because if you don't specify a provider, what Terraform does is that under the hood, it basically takes the resource name and the first word of the resource, which is AWS, it automatically tries to look for a provider defined with the local name AWS. And in this example, since I've got two providers, it's always going to go for the provider which doesn't have an alias specified as a default. If you want to specifically use a different provider for which you have set up an alias, you'd want to go in here and explicitly provide the provider as AWS data science, basically. And that would then make sure that you're using the AWS provider, which is configured to call or interact with resources only at the EUS1 region, which is basically Ireland, whereas EUS2 is London. And this is only necessary if you're actually not planning to use the default AWS provider, which in this case, this example would be this one, EUS2. And that's why it's quite important to make sure or try to at least use the locally, the preferred provider name as your local provider name. And the same goes for any other provider, really. Try to always make sure that you've got the preferred name for the provider as the local provider name, because this is what Terraform is going to be using throughout your code, and to match up which resource needs to use which provider. And if you don't want to explicitly define that in all of your config, then the best thing to do is to stick to the preferred names. And yeah, that's it for this lesson. Just wanted to focus on provider. And if anybody has got any questions, then feel free to drop them in the comments, and I'll follow up on them. Thank you. Bye.